Morning, everyone. Another week, another extreme MAGA Republican bill on the floor of the House of Representatives. Today, we will vote against, as Democrats, the Child Deportation Act, the Republican effort to try to weaponize and politicize the border as opposed to doing something meaningful about it. Child Deportation Act, this extreme MAGA Republican piece of legislation, will throw out children who are fleeing, in many cases, extreme violence and persecution. It will build a medieval border wall that is a 14th century solution to a 21st century problem and waste billions of taxpayer dollars. And it will adversely impact the ability of the Customs and Border Patrol agency to do its job in stopping dangerous drugs like fentanyl from coming into our country. The Child Deportation Act is not a serious effort to deal with the issue related to our broken immigration system. Democrats do have a proposal championed by Congresswoman Linda Sanchez, the U.S. Citizenship Act. That is a real effort to address our immigration system, create a viable path forward, make sure that there's order at the border while at the same time respecting our history as a nation of immigrants. But another week, another extreme MAGA Republican piece of legislation that the Republican majority is trying to jam down the throats of the American people. Early this week, we had a very good, productive, honest, open conversation convened by President Joe Biden in the White House, and he has set us on a positive path forward to make sure that we do not default on America's debt for the first time in our nation's history. A default would be catastrophic, a default would be dangerous, a default will be devastating for everyday Americans. It would trigger a job-killing recession, resulting in the loss of millions of good-paying jobs. A default will crash the stock market and hurt in an adversely devastating way the retirement security of millions of older Americans, and a default will dramatically increase costs for people all across the country. We have to avoid a default at all costs. That's the position of House Democrats. That's the position of Senate Democrats. Mitch McConnell articulated that position in front of the White House on Tuesday. President Biden has been making that clear from the very beginning. And it's my hope that the extreme MAGA Republicans understand that we have to end the dangerous flirtation with default, make sure America pays our bills, and simultaneously, let's have the conversation about the types of investments and spending decisions and revenue raising that would most benefit the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people. Questions? Darren?
On default, at this town hall last night, the former president said to Republican congressmen and senators, if they don't give you massive cuts, you're going to have to do a default. I wonder how you think that affects the discussions you're having about trying to avoid that outcome.
Well, it's unfortunate because there are a lot of extreme MAGA Republicans in the House right now who share the same position that former President Trump articulated, which is that the American people either need to absorb dramatic, extreme, right-wing ideological cuts to things like Medicaid benefits for disabled children and seniors, older Americans who are in nursing homes, that the American people are expected to absorb dramatic cuts to health care funding that could result in millions of people losing their health coverage. The American people are expected to absorb dramatic cuts to food insecurity programs when there are more than 30 million Americans who are currently food insecure. The American people are expected to absorb dramatic cuts to education funding and to public safety funding. Or if Democrats do not bend the knee to this extreme MAGA Republican Default on America Act, Republicans are saying the other option is to default. That's exactly what President Trump laid out last night. And we've been saying that from the very beginning. It's an inherently unreasonable position. They're not interested in having a legitimate discussion on public policy. From the very beginning, this has been a hostage-taking situation. That's what President Biden has made clear. That's what we've made clear. And now, President Trump has clearly indicated what we've been saying for the longest period of time. This is not about a public policy discussion related to the future of the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people. It's a hostage-taking situation. Accept the dramatic cuts or default. Neither are acceptable.
You're headed back to the White House tomorrow. I'm just curious to know what you're looking to gain from the second meeting since the staffs have been working together. Can you share what your hopes and expectations are for the meeting tomorrow?
Well, it's my understanding it was a very productive conversation at the staff level yesterday. It's my expectation there will be continued conversations today. And I'm thankful that President Biden has set us on a path toward resolving this issue, and that the meeting that is expected to take place at the White House tomorrow will be a continuation of that path, and I expect that it will go well.
You said that the GOP's border security bill that they're voting on today will prevent Border Patrol agents from being able to seize drugs like fentanyl from coming across the border. I'm just wondering if you could please elaborate on what exactly you're referring to there.
Yeah, it's going to impact the CBP's ability from a resource standpoint to do the type of enforcement that is necessary in dealing with drug interdiction. And that's because this is all based on a false premise that fentanyl is coming into our country, according to the extreme MAGA Republicans, from people who are entering this country illegally. When statistics clearly indicate that approximately 90% of the fentanyl that comes into this country comes through the ports of entry, not as a result of illegal crossings. And the majority of individuals who are detained for illegally bringing fentanyl into this country happen to be United States citizens. So, as is often the case with my extreme MAGA Republican colleagues, they create a fictional argument around what's happening at the border and then actually do nothing to solve the real problem. And that is exactly what the Child Deportation Act is all about.
Thank you. Good morning. There's been part of this conversation about just cuts on the debt ceiling, but Congressman Lieu, some others have said we need to look at the revenue side. You've been critical, and other Democrats have been critical of some of the Trump tax cuts and the impact of what that's done to the revenue side of things here. Can you talk about that maybe in specifics a little bit, and what are the political dangers of that if people interpret some of that as being a tax increase?
Well, President Biden has consistently made clear that there will be no tax increase on any American who makes $400,000 or less. Period, full stop. President Biden has kept his word, and Democrats in the House and in the Senate stand behind the president, as far as I can tell, as it relates to that particular side of revenues. At the same time, President Biden released his budget, and in his budget, it protects and strengthens Social Security, It builds an economy from the middle out and the bottom up, and it will cut the deficit by $3 trillion on a moving forward basis in the 10-year budget window. In part, by making sure that we end wasteful subsidies to big oil, end wasteful subsidies to big pharma, and we find other aspects of our spending that is wasteful or subject to fraud and abuse.
But are you looking for equilibrium in that? If they say, okay, here's some cuts, we have to make that up on the revenue side as you go into the
If my Republican colleagues really want to have a conversation about how do we meet the needs of the American people and reduce the deficit in a fiscally responsible way, it's impossible to have that discussion without talking about revenue. And by the way, the 2017 GOP tax scam, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%, at the same time was not paid for. We went into an additional $2 trillion worth of debt to subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless. It makes no sense. And yet, nowhere in the discussion, while my colleagues are trying to hold the economy hostage, as Donald Trump indicated, is the plan, is the strategy, is the approach, nowhere have they discussed putting revenue on the table, which tells you this is not really about having a legitimate public policy discussion.
Just wonder if you could just comment on the House Oversight Committee's report that they put out that the Biden family members and business associates received $10 million from foreign business deals. And if you just have a response to that regarding Comer and Republican lawmakers talking about this in the past few days.
There was nothing in the report, as I understand it, that had anything to do with President Joe Biden. And what has been happening, and my Republican colleagues, both in terms of the so-called Weaponization Committee, which is really just a select committee to protect insurrectionists or obstruct justice, and the fake investigations that are taking place on the oversight side of the equation, have produced anything real or meaningful or of interest to the American people. This House Republican majority has done nothing on inflation, nothing on the economy, nothing on jobs, nothing on health care, nothing even meaningful on public safety. It's just one fishing expedition after the next, and they've all been a big, giant fail.
Yes, Leader Jeffries, as a New Yorker, have you had any conversation with Wall Street leaders about the risk of a default?
It's a great question, and business leaders on Wall Street, throughout New York State and across the country have all made clear to me in any conversation that I've had that a default would be catastrophic for the American people, for small businesses, for banks, for business generally across the United States of America, and for the economy. And I think it's important for some of my Republican colleagues who claim to be reasonable, traditional, moderate type of members, but every time they have an opportunity to vote, including on the Default on America Act, they don't vote the moderate position, they vote the extreme position. And I think it's going to be important, several of them from New York. And I think it's going to be important for those New York business leaders and others to have those conversations with some of my Republican colleagues to say to them, or to make clear the implications of a default. And we don't need my Republican colleagues to just talk like moderates on TV or act like moderates at home in the district. They should vote like moderates and do the right thing for the American people and avoid a default. Third row.
Do you have a reaction to the death of Jordan Neely in your home city?
It was a very tragic situation, an incredibly disturbing video. Jordan Neely, in my view, should be alive today. And it's my expectation that the Manhattan District Attorney will have a full, a fair, a comprehensive investigation follow the facts, apply the law, and then present that information to a grand jury and to the people of the state of New York.
Thank you. I would like to go back to President Trump. In the context of what you heard last night at the CNN town hall, what in your mind would his potential return to power mean for the United States?
Well, it would be a very dangerous, devastating, and destructive thing if Donald Trump got anywhere close to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and Exhibit A for the trauma that the American people will experience if that were to happen were his own words and performance at that so-called town hall meeting. The modern-day Republican Party is the party of Marjorie Taylor Greene, George Santos, and Donald Trump. That's the reality, folks. You can't make this stuff up. That's the reality. And later on today, apparently, House Republicans are going to try to pass legislation that will restrict, if not end, the ability of the federal government to confront unemployment insurance fraud. At the same time that one of the leaders of the House Republican Conference here in Washington, D.C., George Santos, has been charged with unemployment insurance fraud. Why do I say he's one of the leaders? Because the Default on America Act would not have passed the House of Representatives without the support of George Santos, who was the deciding vote. And perhaps that explains why my Republican colleagues have failed to take any action to remove someone who is clearly unfit to serve in the People's House.
On that, you said before that you and Kevin McCarthy are friends, you talk a lot, you text each other. Have you had any conversations with Kevin McCarthy about George Santos? I know the House has been very reluctant to expel one of their own, but has there been any sort of discussion with the Speaker about any support you all would offer or anything regarding George Santos?
Not this week, not recently, but I have made clear, both to Speaker McCarthy and others, that I find the whole George Santos thing an untenable situation. It's beyond the pale. He lied his way in to the United States House of Representatives, separate and apart from the very serious indictment that just came down this week, separate and apart from the criminal indictment. Reasonable people back at home in New York and throughout America have already concluded the guy does not belong in a separate and co-equal branch of government at the highest level here in the United States of America. That is not an extreme position. That should be a mainstream position on the other side of the aisle, but apparently it is not. Go here and then come back up. Yeah.
So the president was in your home state yesterday talking about the Assault on America plan, as Democrats call it. And he also talked about Representative Mike Lawler, who was in attendance, and he said, you know, he's not one of those MAGA Republicans. Do you think that kind of talk is helpful as Democrats try to take back the House, especially in New York and these districts upstate?
Yeah, I haven't seen the actual video of the remarks, but what I can say about the representative from the 17th Congressional District of New York, Mike Lawler, seems like a decent enough individual interpersonally, but what should matter are the facts of his voting record. And Mike Lawler's voting record are pretty clear. He voted to restrict reproductive freedom the first month he arrived here in the Congress. That's not mainstream, that's extreme. He voted to put polluters over people within his first 100 days here in the United States House of Representatives, as opposed to building upon the work that we've done as Democrats, led by President Biden, to dramatically confront the climate crisis and set our planet on a sustainable trajectory forward. Voting to put polluters over people is not mainstream. That's extreme. And to top it all off, it appears to me that the representative from the 17th Congressional District of New York voted for a 22% across-the-board cut as part of the Default on America Act, despite expressing concerns and reservations and trepidation, and then raced to the floor of the House of Representatives and voted to devastate Medicaid, devastate food insecurity programs, devastate education, devastate health care, devastate support for law enforcement. That's not mainstream, as far as I can tell. That's extreme. That is the track record. And so that's the only thing that I, as an individual, can speak to relative to the representative from the 17th Congressional District in New York.
Thank you, Congressman. Just circling back to George Santos, what message is Kevin McCarthy sending to the American people by refusing to demand Santos's resignation?
Well, listen, I respect Speaker McCarthy, and I respect his position relative to his articulation of the appropriate response to the indictment. Before the indictment, I've made clear that George Santos is not fit to serve in the United States House of Representatives. And the American people share that opinion as well, including the overwhelming majority of the people in the 3rd Congressional District in New York. And so I think this is a question for the House Republican Conference in its entirety to decide. Who are you? Who are you? Are you the grand old party? Are you the party that puts guns over people? Are you the party of George Santos and Marjorie Taylor Greene? Are you the party that will continue to bend the knee to the insurrectionists in chief? Who are you? These are questions that I think the American people should be reasonably asking, because the extreme MAGA Republicans right now temporarily hold the gavels in the House of Representatives. Last question.
Question on the budget talks. What's your feeling on permitting reform? There's a lot of chatter in this town that there could be some common ground there. Do you feel that that's the case?
Well, let's see if it comes up in the context of the discussion at the White House tomorrow. I think our view has been pretty clear that we have to avoid a dangerous default in the same way that has taken place over the last several decades under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, including 3 times, without gamesmanship, partisanship, or brinksmanship during the presidency of Donald Trump. That should happen because it is the right thing to do for our country. America must always pay our bills. But at the same time, as President Biden, Leader Schumer, Democrats in the House have continued to articulate, we believe in the process of discussing public policy issues, whether that's the budget, whether that relates to the appropriations process, or whether that relates to how best to build upon the historic public policy efforts to confront the climate crisis with the Inflation Reduction Act and stand up a clean energy economy.